So again, I'm going to get into a little bit on what controls balance. Again, like I said, I love education. I think you have to kind of have it make sense in order for it to stick in your brain. And I just want to talk to you guys a little bit about what controls balance, why balance might go bad. I think there's, well, I see it all the time, that there's somewhat of a misconception that people fall because they're weak. Their legs are weak. I hear it from the physicians or the providers. I hear it from my clients. I'm weak, my legs are wobbly, and I fall. And although I will agree that a lot of times when I strength test them, they do have some weakness because they have decreased their activity level. But for most people, strength is not the reason they're falling. It's not helping them, but it's not probably the primary reason that they're falling. And so as a physical therapist, I can sit, and a lot of times I can have them do all the leg kicks at the counter I want, do all the leg strengthening, and it's not going to hurt them by any means, but I might not be getting at the root of the problem. And so I might see them and do a whole bunch of strengthening and a whole bunch of gait training, you know, with a walker or a cane, and send them on their way, and they're going to be at just as high of a fall risk because I haven't addressed what's going on with the systems that do regulate balance that we're going to talk about. So in a nutshell, the three systems that control balance are eyes, ears, and feet. And I'll just talk a little bit about how each of those, what each of those contributes, and what you might see if they're having kind of dysfunction or problems in any of those areas. So with eyes, when I look, I'm not looking at so much at, you know, like when you go to the eye doctor and you're doing a vision test, you know, if I can read the letters that are going across the chart. I'm not so concerned about somebody's clarity of vision or what their prescription of their eyeglasses is, but I'm thinking more about what we call gaze stabilization. And gaze stabilization is, there's this really close link, at least nerve-wise, between your eyes and the way they track, so kind of the way they move back and forth, and what's going on in the inner ear, which we're going to spend some time talking about, but that's kind of where our key balance system is. And they're closely related, so I can kind of see what's going on. So when, for example, when I turn my head really quick, I can still keep you guys in pretty good focus. A little bit of blurriness, but not bad. I can keep you guys really pretty clear because I have good gaze stabilization, as all of us probably do in this room. You know, when you have somebody that has a camcorder and they're doing a movie and they turn really quick and you want to throw up as it moves because it's all a blur. Video cameras don't have very good gaze stabilization, probably getting better, but they don't. So when you move it, it can't keep up with the tracking, and so it just blurs. And gaze stabilization is something that, again, stays strong when our balance system is strong, and so when it gets weak, people will start to have a breakdown of that. And so when they turn their head quickly, they might not keep you guys all in focus like I'm doing right now. And so they turn their head, and everything's a blur, and you know what it's like. Everything becomes a blur, and it's kind of like, ugh, kind of funny feedback, and it makes you feel not very stable on your feet because we use our eyes so much for visual information. So when I do a balance assessment on somebody, I'm looking at things that are going on with their eyes. Are they able to hold a point? So like I said, if I look really, you know, if I look at your face and turn my head really quick, I can keep you really focused. A lot of people, their eyes are going everywhere that their head's moving, and I know that their gaze stabilization isn't very good. It's really cool because I can actually do exercises to help that, just like I can strengthen the biceps. I can strengthen that system with some exercises. Not necessarily something that you would pick up on day-to-day things when working with your clients. They might talk about just what I described, turning and having a lot of blurriness. They might talk about double vision or bouncy vision. When people talk about that, that kind of triggers something for me when they tell me something like that it is blurry, that it's double, things are kind of moving around on the walls. And that's an indication that they have a disconnect kind of between what's going on with their eyes and their balance system. So that's something I look at, and we end up doing a ton of exercises with people. It's kind of funny because they say, well, I'm falling and it's my legs, and here we are doing all these, you know, eye exercises, but there's a method usually to our madness. So that's one thing I look at. We know that for most of our seniors, and again, as a home health therapist, just like I would imagine for most of your clients, I mean, we work with the senior population. I mean, that's going to be 90-some% of our group. You know, we're not really working with people too often below that senior age. But so for our senior population, we also see that they tend to become quite visually dependent for some reason. Out of these three systems, eyes, ears, feet, that we use, for some reason, we seem to gravitate toward vision as we age, and we tend to want to shift and rely on it the most, which isn't a horrible thing, except that for most of us, a lot of people do have kind of degradation of different vision systems within. We get a lot of macular degeneration, glaucoma, cataracts, and those kinds of things that change depth and contrast and all that can affect our balance. We see this and we know it because when I go in and ask somebody when they fall, a lot of times they tell me that they fall at night when they're getting up to go to the bathroom. So it's dark, and they don't have their house well lit, they don't turn night lights or anything like that, and they get up to go to the bathroom and they don't have good visual input and they fall. So I know that they're relying on their vision when they shouldn't necessarily be doing that. Again, we can do some things to kind of shift. There's some different exercises where we can kind of get them to try not to rely so much on their vision, but to rely on these other systems. But we just see it, and it just tends to be a trend. It's what our bodies do. Our brains and our bodies are incredible the way they manage something, but it's the way they manage ourselves. But that's one area where we kind of, not our smartest move. But anyway, so if you see people that have maybe a really difficult time in the dark, whether it's if you happen to be with them at nighttime dark hours, or you hear them talk a lot about being out at night, and especially we see it all the time, night trying to go across their driveway or grass or something, because then you get hit doubly because you get funny surfaces and dark. It's a really classic time when people fall. Again, something that they kind of have some visual dependence and maybe trying to use their eyes more than they should. So those are a couple things I think of when I look at their eyes and what contributions that has. Feet. What we're thinking about with feet is you can kind of again imagine, I mean, our feet are our connection to the ground, to the surface. And so we get a ton of information about what's going on underneath us through our feet. Part of that is just kind of feeling pressure, light touch, sharp things, that kind of thing, you know, if we step on a tack. But a lot of it also is feeling, my ankles are a huge contributor to my balance. And if you ever pay attention when you're doing something and you're off balance, you'll really notice that your ankles are moving a lot, trying to keep you balanced. And it's one of our major strategies with balance, is information through our ankles. And we have receptors in there, and they should pick stuff up. Like if I am going up a hill, you know, and my ankles are bent this way, I should get good signals to my brain saying, well, she's going up a hill, stabilize these other muscles so she doesn't keep going forward. When my ankles are bent the other way because I'm going down a hill, should send information saying, okay, going down a hill, stabilize so she just doesn't fall backwards. Or if I'm on uneven surfaces where I'm kind of, my feet aren't just nice and solid, like gravel, sand, grass, again, that information all feeds up to my brain. So we test, in therapy, we test all those things, you know, and see if they can tell, make sure that they can tell, or their ankles are telling them if they're tilted sideways, up or down. So we look at that, but the other thing we look at is what is their sensation like? And we do little tests where we poke the foot with these little teeny filaments and see if they have numbness or not. Kind of relating back to that point I brought up about the peripheral neuropathy that we see with folks with diabetes. And so I like to see, some people aren't in touch with it. I'll say, how are your feet? Fine, no problems. And I go to test them, and they can feel 0 out of the 10 points, which means no, their feet actually aren't okay. I mean, they can feel big things, you know, if I slug them with a sledgehammer, but they're not feeling what the Diabetic Association considers what you need to have for protective sensation. And so some of them are right on top of it. They say, yeah, I'm numb. And these are a lot of things that you guys might pick up on, or that your clients might tell you about. Because, again, I think that you're having a lot of time where you might be helping them shoes and socks, you might be helping them with bathing, and they have a lot of opportunity to complain about their feet. So those are some things to think about too. If somebody's talking about, again, burning, stabbing, pins and needles in their feet, it's just like if your foot's asleep and then we say, okay, let's get up and go, and you go to take those first steps on it, it feels funny. It does not feel very good. And you don't feel very stable until you can kind of work it out. Well, some folks with neuropathy, and it's not always from diabetes, you can have neuropathy from other things that aren't from diabetes, but that's where we mostly see it, so that's the example I bring up. They feel that all the time. It's not that it goes and comes every so often, it just matters how bad it is. You know, it's always there. So a little thing to kind of file back again. If you're having somebody complain about that, imagine they might not be very stable, especially because it's probably not the only thing going on. You know, they probably have that in addition to some other things. So when they're talking about pain in their feet, burning, stabbing, numbness, and you can always be on the lookout. I always say, you know, I don't know that feet are any of our favorite thing, especially feet. Feet tend to really, I think, indicate a lot about a person's health. And you know, especially with circulation disorders and diabetes and those kinds of things, you know, when you're there and you see somebody that has the really big, thick toenails, things like that, that's an indication. They probably don't have real good health of a lot of their circulation system and things like that. Probably an indicator that maybe their feet are feeling okay, but there's a good chance they're having some weird things going on. A lot of swelling and edema usually interferes with what they can sense and what they can feel in their feet. So those are things you just want to say. I would say the health of the feet is really, you know, an indication. When you see real poor looking skin and nails and that kind of thing, I just, you know, usually indicate something to me about kind of their general health status. So so that's just something you might hear from some of your clients. That might be, again, another red flag. And then the last system, so again, so we did eyes, we did feet, we'll do inner ear. I was saying that because it's the one that really is the primary regulator. I'll say it's the one that I think most people tend to know the least about, and it's the most interesting, I think. So in the inner ear, and you might have heard it, we frequently call it the vestibular system, or the inner ear balance system, and people kind of refer to it in different ways. But, you know, in the ear, it's a small area, and there's a lot going on. There's an incredible amount going on in this very small area. And, you know, we have hearing, and then beyond the hearing, a little bit further in is what we call the inner ear. And that's where we house our balanced vestibular system. And people will tell me, I'll say, well, I'm going to think a little bit about what's going on in your ear. And they'll, of course, say, yeah, I'm kind of hard of hearing. And I kind of take that with a grain of salt. They're two different systems. They might correlate and it might not. So just because you're hard of hearing doesn't mean your balance is affected. And if your balance is affected, it doesn't mean your hearing is affected. So I kind of take it for what they say and nod, because usually they want to tell me it's, you know, their hearing has changed over the last 6 months, and that's all great, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. So in that inner ear system, it's pretty neat. That's a system that tells our brain, again, all of this is information that feeds to our brain, and then our brain tells our body what to do. So the inner ear system feeds to our brain and tells us pretty much what is going on with our head and kind of our body position with relation to our environment. So what's going on in there is there's these little tubes, kind of like little rubber tubes, you know, little, and they have fluid in them. And they're oriented kind of in these circles. And they have this fluid in them, and when we move, the fluid goes around, and when it goes around, it sends a signal to our brain and says what we're doing. So when I lean forward like this, the fluid in this little canal that's oriented here goes around, sends a signal to my brain, says, she's tipping forward. Again, maybe stabilize some of these muscles so she doesn't just fall down. Or I turn to the right, fluid goes around in a different set of canals, tells my brain, she's looking to the right, stabilize over here so she doesn't fall over. And it's really neat, and it works really well for those of us who are active, at least fairly active and mobile. And it's a neat system. So, and when we're strong, and that system stays strong by movement. So when I'm moving my head a lot, normal activity for most of us, it stays strong. Just like when I use my arms for my daily activity, my biceps stay strong or my quads stay strong. My inner ear system stays strong by movement. Specifically head movement, but usually most any type of movement. So you can imagine little kids running around, man, their system is getting fed tons. You know, they're doing somersaults, they're playing on that merry-go-round. They don't get nauseous from roller coaster rides, and they could spin all day long, and they don't get sick. It doesn't bother them. Their system is so incredibly strong that you can assault it with anything, and they don't get dizzy. They don't get funny feelings like that. And as we age, even really, I think, you know, into our 30s, I mean, I was trying to think, and I do these kind of exercises with people all the time, and I know when I got into my 30s, you know, I was having a hard time at amusement parks. I was starting to get much more reactive to, you know, roller coasters and twirling and stuff than I used to be. Because we're still active, but we're not the same active as when you're 5. So now we look at our folks that we all work with, and what is their level of activity? Well, I don't know about you guys, but most of the people I work with, I'm happy to get them out of a chair, out of a bed, maybe taking a walk. And if they do take a walk, most of them are not real mobile with it. They're maybe walking with a walker, and they're walking like this, and when you say, "Hi, Mabel," they kind of turn, "Oh, hi." You know, they're not looking around, "Oh, hi, it's a beautiful day, look at the birds in the trees," and, you know, bending down. They're not moving very much. So, again, if they're walking stiff. I call it this on guard, on block posture. When they turn, they don't look like this. They kind of do a whole body turn. They're not moving their head. So again, we're happy to get them out of the chair, and if they do get out of the chair, it's still pretty limited for the most part. Certainly not what we were seeing earlier in life, and again, for most of us, we're dealing with people who have had some situation where they are moving even less so than another typical 60, 70, 80-year-old. So their system is not being stimulated. It's just like if I roped their arms to their side, their biceps are going to completely degenerate. So now they have a system in their inner ear where it's very weak, just like a muscle system. It's not a muscle, but it's weak, just like we would lose a muscle system. And it becomes kind of sensitive. So if they ever did have to turn quick, you can imagine if you have the system that doesn't give very much input, and then, wow, an alarm went off or something went off, and they did turn their head, and that fluid went around, which never happens to them, woo, kind of sends a crazy signal to their brain because they're so used to non-stimulus that that's a huge signal. So to them, actually, that little bit of movement probably to them feels like they just did a full spin, and you know, they're kind of holding on. So a huge thing that you see, and I think this is really classic, and I think it's a huge area for us to look at and for you guys to be tuned into, is what happens when they're moving their head and you're with them. And so, for example, a lot of things that we see, if they happen to be reaching up into a shelf in the closet, bathroom, something, they go to reach up, you do that little bit of head movement. For a lot of them, that little bit of head movement gets them to do a little stutter step. Now mine might even be exaggerated. It might be even more subtle than mine. So you really have to watch for it. But anytime you see a little bit of that kind of, come on, there's one up here if you need it.
I told them last time it was a bad
So anytime you see a little bit of what I call kind of compensation movement, so again, if they look up and they kind of catch themselves, if they look sideways and they kind of do a little stutter step, and again, it could be much more subtle than I'm even saying. I'd love it to be that, then you really know, but sometimes it's just that. That is a huge indicator that they're having inner ear weakness. That system in their ear is weak, and so when they go to turn their head or move, they're having to catch themselves because it's throwing them off balance, just that little bit of movement. So one of the big things I think, and really the biggest, I think one of the biggest things that when I'm working with groups is watch for things like that. When they're sitting in a chair and maybe they bend over to put on a sock, put on a shoe, reach for something under, if they either describe to you or actually kind of physically almost do kind of come out, a lot of them will say, "Whoa, I thought I was just going to keep going right over." Again, that's an inner ear thing. They are bending their head and they are getting a perception of movement when they're not moving. That means something's going on in their inner ear they're being extra sensitive to. A great indicator for fall risk. Like I said, every time you move your head, and you can even try this a little bit, just do it safely, but you know, if you're standing there and you happen to see, you know, be with one of your clients and you know, just a touch, you know, look over and kind of see how they respond. Again, they should be pretty solid, because what we know is if they get a little bit of shuffle or a little bit of change in their movement from that, when something big comes up, it could be the one that, you know, one time and they do a sidestep and they fall down and we have a fractured hip. So that's a huge thing I think to look for. Does that kind of make sense how that works? And it's kind of neat. Again, the great thing about it is it doesn't mean that's where they're at. We can strengthen that system again, just like we strengthen muscle systems like the biceps or the quads. We can do exercises for that system and get them stronger, so that now when they turn their head or look up or look down, they don't get those movements. I was thinking in the summertime we always get this huge amount of referrals for people that are always laughing. It's like when it starts to get nice enough to pull the hoses out and they start to want to reach down and pick up their hoses and sprinklers, and they fall down. And that's always a big thing when summer starts, because they start moving more. So the other thing that I want to refer to when we're talking about the inner ear is dizziness. I know we all brought up, and Connie was talking initially about a client that was really really sensitive to dizziness. Dizziness can be a result of a couple of different things. Primarily the three areas that we see dizziness associated with are medications. You guys probably know too, almost every medication these days has a side effect of dizziness. Blood pressure issues. Again, typically if they're on blood pressure medications and they do a change in position, like lying down to sitting up or sitting up to standing, they get that lightheadedness. So that's kind of related to their blood pressure. Their blood pressure may or may not be appropriately set. I always think that's good for the doctors to know, because they might be able to adjust them. It might be optimized, but it might not be. And then the third reason is inner ear dysfunction. Again, just the inner ear weakness, like what we talk about. So again, I might be working with this client who, when they look up, I'll do this all the time, we'll be walking down a hall, I'll say, okay, look left, as they're walking, good, look right, look up, look down. If they report to me any dizziness with that, or again, lightheadedness, funny feelings in the head, that's not dizziness that's medication related, because that doesn't come out of the blue. It's not blood pressure related, because that's not when we see blood pressure related dizziness. That's when they're moving their head. That's inner ear. And so again, it's because their system is sensitive, it's weak, and so now when I'm getting them to move it, that fluid's going around in there, giving them a little bit bigger hit than they're usually and it's kind of causing this conflict in their brain, and so to them they feel like it's a lot of movement when it's a little bit. So when they talk to me about dizziness with movement, I'm really thinking inner ear. And again, it's great because I can do exercises to get through that. So another great thing to file back in your bank, dizziness, especially with head movement, body movements. I always say the coming up from laying down or sit to stand, really we end up doing a lot of trying to tease that out, because again, that really could be blood pressure and it could be inner ear. And I don't really have a good idea for that unless I sit down and kind of do some testing, and we'll take blood pressure readings and all of that. But so if somebody has dizziness when they're going from lying down to sitting up, I don't assume it's blood pressure, which I think a lot of people do, and I don't assume it's inner ear. I think you just have to do a little bit more testing. But if you're seeing that, just know it might be blood pressure, and that's probably what they'll say, and it's probably what their family members will say, and it might be, but it might be inner ear stuff also. So just to kind of keep in the back of your brain. Vertigo, so spinning when the whole world, so not so much lightheadedness, but when the world feels like it's spinning and you're holding on, is another thing we end up working with within our kind of program and treatment. Typically, when somebody's truly spinning, it is related to some inner ear dysfunction. In this case, you have a funny little thing where there's these little crystals that are in those little canals, and if one comes loose, it spins around, and it gives people this perception of spinning, especially with movement. And there's some very specific treatment that you have to do with that. Again, I can do all the strengthening and all the other stuff. If I don't do a very specific treatment with that, then we're not going to get to the bottom of that. So if somebody talks about true spinning, again, another big red flag, you'd want to think about kind of a therapy assess on that to see if it's this inner ear dysfunction where this little crystal comes loose and wreaks havoc.
It's at the time too, where it's like, it seems like the world is